Did you know that many Nazis fled to South America with the help of secret networks? Uncensored. It all started on an ordinary afternoon, while I was sorting through some old boxes in the attic of my grandfather's house. He had passed away a few months earlier, and no one in the family wanted to touch his things. It was as if there was a silent respect, or perhaps a hidden fear of what we might find. That's when I saw a dark leather briefcase, hidden under loose floorboards. The leather was already dry with age, but it still gave off that strong, almost metallic smell. Inside, I found documents written in German, hand-scratched maps, and a list of names that, at first glance, meant nothing. But one of them chilled me to the core. And it was there, in that silent, dusty moment, that I realized there was a dark secret hidden within my own family. And this secret was directly linked to the Nazis' escape to South America. I needed to understand what, exactly, my grandfather had done, and why. Subscribe to the channel to stay up to date with the best uncensored accounts of World War II. Like and comment on what you think of the accounts, okay? Let's continue with the story. My grandfather was always a difficult figure to decipher. A man of few words, a firm gaze, and an aura that blended severity and secrecy. He never spoke about the war, even though everyone knew he lived through that turbulent period in Europe before coming to Brazil. I grew up with incomplete stories, fragments told by relatives in hushed tones, as if there were something forbidden in those memories. My mother said he had come from Germany shortly after the end of World War II, but no one ever knew the details. Not even where exactly he lived before leaving. It was as if part of his life had been erased, or purposefully hidden. After his death, I had the thankless task of sifting through what he left behind. I expected to find ordinary documents, old clothes, perhaps the occasional black and white photograph. But what I found in that leather briefcase changed everything. It wasn't just a collection of papers, it was a legacy of shadows. Each page carried the weight of something that had been carefully silenced for decades. There were letters with letterheads from organizations I'd never heard of. Some bore strange coats of arms, crossed symbols, Latin phrases, and dates that coincided with the final years of the war. In one of them, I recognized words like Vatican, asylum, protection, and a name scrawled at the bottom, Eichmann. Yes, Adolf Eichmann, the logistical architect of the Holocaust. I froze. Beside the letters were 3 passports, all forged, all with different names, but the same photo, a man with icy eyes and blonde hair, who stared at me with a mocking expression. On the back of one of them, a sentence written in German in nervous handwriting, Die Wahrheit reißt im Schatten. Truth travels in shadows. I began to feel that this wasn't just a historical find. It was personal. My grandfather wouldn't have kept this kind of material by chance. He wasn't a historian. He wasn't a collector. So why hide false documents and letters bearing the name of one of history's greatest war criminals? Who were those men in the passports? And, most importantly, what was his connection to all of this? I searched every corner of the house trying to find answers. I found old photos of men in uniform, not the typical Allied soldiers, but men with insignia reminiscent of the SS. In one, my grandfather smiled, young, alongside 2 other men in front of a building that looked like a monastery. On the back, the inscription, San Giorgio, 1947. Researching later, I discovered that this was the name of an ancient monastery in Italy used as an escape route for Nazis in exile. Coincidence? It no longer seemed like a coincidence at all. My grandfather, by all appearances, had been part of something much larger. Something carefully planned, shrouded in secrecy, silence, and pacts. Perhaps he regretted it. Perhaps he tried to hide it from himself, hiding the papers with him. But even in death, he had left clues. It was as if he wanted someone, one day, to know the truth. And that someone was me. At that moment, I understood that my mission had just begun. I needed to follow the trail of these shadows. I needed to understand my grandfather's role, the workings of these escape networks, and the reason why so many men managed to escape justice. I needed to discover where the official story ends, and where the real story begins. buried, forgotten, perhaps conveniently erased. And, above all, I needed to know if the blood running through my veins is the same that helped monsters disappear into the mists of South America. I spent days trying to understand the documents. Most were in German, others in Italian, a few in Spanish. They were loose sheets, some yellowed, others more recent, as if this archive had been gradually fed, carefully built over decades. But one of the papers stood out from the rest, a detailed file, with personal information, dates, notes in red pen, and a nearly faded stamp that read, "Warning, high risk." The name at the top made me swallow hard. Klaus Barbie. I knew that name. Everyone who studies World War II history even slightly has heard of it. Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon. Head of the Gestapo in that French city, responsible for hundreds of arrests, tortures, and executions. A sadist. A monster. But what made me shudder wasn't just finding his name there, it was the way it was recorded. The notes revealed escape routes, names of contacts in Italy and Bolivia, dates spanning the years 1945 to 1951. Among the data was a sea passage from Genoa to Buenos Aires, using the name Klaus Altmann. That name, it was precisely the pseudonym Barbie used to flee Europe and live years with impunity in South America. In other words, the document in front of me was not a reproduction of something public. It was an original, an internal record, a piece of truth that escaped historical censorship. My heart raced. There was something dirty in that file, something that didn't belong to me, and yet, now it was in my custody. I began to wonder, how did it reach my grandfather? Had he known this man? Had he participated in his escape? The questions consumed me, and with them came fear. Yes, real fear. Of discovering more than I could bear. Because if my grandfather had connections to someone like Barbie, then what else was hidden there? I continued rummaging through the folder, my hands trembling now. I found a list of coded names. Each name had a date and an acronym. Some I recognized, Mengele, Eichmann, Priebke. Others I'd never heard of, but they were there, side by side, like pieces of a dark puzzle. There were codes like CR Vatican, PE Italy, BOLCZ, and, next to Barbie, the acronym, Insured. Visa Approved. Altmann/Bolivia. The precision of the material impressed me, but at the same time, it made me nauseous. It was like leafing through the diary of a criminal organization that operated under the nose of official history, protecting murderers, ensuring their comfort while thousands of families mourned the missing of the war. And my grandfather, was he at the center of it? In that moment, I realized it was no longer curiosity. I had crossed a line. That briefcase was more than a family heirloom, it was a window into a dark network, one that helped the most dangerous men of the 20th century escape the tribunal of humanity. I sat on the attic floor with the briefcase open on my lap, surrounded by documents like shards of a distorted mirror of truth. The late afternoon sun streamed in through a crack in the roof, illuminating dust particles dancing in the air, as if time itself were watching me there, ready to unearth secrets that should have remained buried. I closed my eyes for a moment and felt the weight of it all on my shoulders. It was a strange sensation, a mixture of fear, shame, and responsibility, because now I knew. And once you see what's behind the veil, there's no way you can pretend you didn't see it. I needed to dig deeper. I needed to understand who the other names on that list were. I needed to follow the trail of blood and silence left by these figures. And, above all, I needed to discover how far my grandfather was involved. And maybe, discover who he really was. I didn't sleep that night. I kept turning over the documents as if each page held the key to a greater and darker secret. But it was at dawn, with burning tired eyes, that I found what was perhaps the clearest and most frightening piece of all. Folded with military precision, between the pages of a typed letter in Italian, was a map. It was thick paper with old creases, faded lines, and points hand-marked in red ink. It was no ordinary map. It traced a route that began in Munich, passed through Innsbruck, crossed the Alps, descended through Genoa, and then dissolved into lines that crossed the Atlantic, mysteriously landing in Buenos Aires, Montevideo, and Rio de Janeiro. The red ink connected these points as if they were stations on an invisible railway. Next to each city were dates, all between 1945 and 1954, some with coded notations, SJ, CR, Safe Farm. It was an escape map, but not just a plan. It was a record of actual movements. The path of the serpent, dragging its tail across 3 continents. The most disturbing thing was on the back of the map. There, glued with some kind of old-fashioned adhesive, were 4 original stamps from fake passports. I touched them with gloves, almost as if they were contaminated. Each one came from a different country: Austria, Italy, Argentina, and Brazil. They were genuine stamps, soiled with age and smudged with humidity, but undeniably authentic. This meant only one thing: someone had actually used this map. More than once. Among the markings, I found a passage with the name of a ship, the SS Giovanna C. I tracked it down, and I discovered that this freighter really existed. It departed from Genoa and made dozens of crossings between Europe and South America between 1946 and 1950. It was discreet, transporting food and agricultural machinery. But among its cargo, according to some forgotten Italian archives, it also carried passengers without official documentation. Passengers who paid dearly never to be found again. Little by little, the picture began to emerge clearly. It was an operation. Well organized. Well financed. And, apparently, he had a network of collaborators spread across ports, consulates, churches, barracks, and even isolated farms. In one of the letters attached to the map, someone's signature, illegible, read, "Transport to Mendoza is confirmed. The rest of the group will continue to Paranagua. Everyone must remain invisible until their Brazilian papers are regularized." Paranagua, Brazil. It fell upon me like a silent thunderclap. It was here. It was close to me. I opened Google Earth, typed in the locations, and compared them with the plotted routes. Every point made sense. It was as if someone had left an unwritten war diary, drawn in lines and codes, waiting for someone, perhaps me, to decipher it decades later. And then, as if it were the final touch to a macabre play, I found another photo. An old, faded portrait, taken somewhere in the humid jungle. 5 men in white suits and Panama hats, standing in front of a simple wooden house. On the back, handwritten, "Santa Cruz de la Sierra, 1952. Among them was a face I swear I recognized from historical photos of a war criminal. But the most terrifying thing was seeing that, in the margins of the photo, a man seemed to be observing the scene, half hidden, half off to the side. And I swear with everything in me, he looked like my grandfather. I said nothing to anyone. I carefully stored everything in a sealed envelope. But in that instant, something inside me changed. It was no longer just a strange inheritance. It was a living clue. A real trail. And I was now part of that story, like it or not. The map wasn't just a path used by fugitives. It was a shortcut to oblivion. A trail of dust and shadows that connected the past to the present. And if I didn't follow that line, if I didn't face where it ended, perhaps it would end inside me. The deeper I delved, the more reality became detached from what I'd learned in books. The official story tells us that the war ended, the criminals were tried, and justice was served. But on the margins of this narrative, there are hidden trails, silent, slippery as snakes. And it was along one of these trails that thousands of Nazis escaped with impunity. Many of them helped by respectable institutions, by untouchable people. By men like my grandfather? After finding the map and the stamps, I began researching obsessively. I spent nights reading digitized documents, forgotten reports, and painstakingly declassified archives. That's how I discovered the term that haunts my mind to this day, ratlines. Rat lines, clandestine routes used to evacuate Nazis from defeated Europe. The best known left Innsbruck, Austria, and passed through Bolzano, reaching Rome or Genoa, where they embarked for Latin America under false identities. But what kept me awake at night was realizing that these routes weren't improvised. They were well structured, with strategic stops, safe havens, paid contacts, and institutional protection. With each new reading, a name emerged: the Vatican. Declassified British and American intelligence reports frequently cited the actions of Catholic clergy, especially members of religious orders based in Rome and Trieste. Many used their positions to issue false baptismal certificates, which were then used to generate international Red Cross passports. Valid, recognized, legitimate documents that hid murderers. It was difficult to accept this. I grew up hearing that good always wins in the end, that monsters pay for their crimes. But there, faced with the coldness with which these routes operated, I realized that the reality is much dirtier. The world remained silent, perhaps out of convenience, perhaps out of fear. I also discovered that many of these fugitives used Italianized Catholic names, such as Giovanni, Luigi, and Carlo, to avoid attracting attention. A document I found at the bottom of my grandfather's briefcase listed exactly that: original names, assumed names, and next to them, a column marked destination. Between them, a name cut out in pen, but legible: Otto Wachter, Nazi governor of Galicia. Officially, he died in Rome, but there were notes there indicating that he might have boarded alive, under another name. And again, like a recurring ghost, there was the signature, the same hesitant handwriting that signs several papers in the folder. My grandfather's. I wanted to believe he simply witnessed it, that he was swept along by the circumstances. But the frequency with which his name appeared, always linked to routes, dates, and pseudonyms, was too disturbing to ignore. And then I understood, he was part of the machine. Maybe he wasn't the commander. Maybe he didn't even know the extent of the evil he was helping to protect. But he was there. He stamped, signed, hid. He participated. And in doing so, he helped cover the monster's tracks. I can't explain what I felt at that moment. A nausea mixed with a sadness that couldn't be contained within me. It was like discovering that the floor of the house where you grew up was built on bones, and that your family helped bury them. The routes were all there. In the letters, on the maps, on the lists. It was like a drainage system for evil. A sewer that led humanity's worst criminals to safe havens in Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil. And no one stopped it. And what torments me most is the silence. The omission. The planned oblivion. Because if these routes existed, and they did, then how many other monsters lived among us? How many kind smiles in markets, bakeries, and churches hid horror stories? How many simple names were, in fact, masks over faces marked by the blood of war? Perhaps the most unbearable truth is this: the Nazis didn't disappear. They adapted. They changed their clothes, their names, their countries, but they continued living, as if nothing had happened. And now, it's up to me, a grandson who only wanted to preserve his grandfather's memories, to discover what else this shadowy route hid from the world. For a long time, I was reluctant to accept what the documents were telling me. I grew up in a Catholic family. I made my first communion, served as an altar boy, and listened to sermons about forgiveness, justice, and redemption. And perhaps because of that, each discovery ate at me more deeply. Because the more I dug, the more evident a truth that seemed too absurd to be real became. The church knew. And, in many cases, it helped. It was in a worn-out letter, folded 3 times and hidden inside the back cover of my grandfather's briefcase, that I found the first direct clue. It was written in Italian, in a fluid, formal hand, dated 1947. At the top was the coat of arms of a Vatican cardinal. The content was brief, almost impersonal, just one line. The bearer of this document must be treated with utmost discretion and urgency. Its history is not our concern. The bearer of this document must be treated with the utmost discretion and urgency. His past is none of our business. The coldness of that sentence hit me like a slap in the face. It was like a veiled blessing, a safe conduct to oblivion, an unspoken pardon, but granted, in the name of what? Politics, fear, convenience. Researching further, I discovered that there was a whole network of monasteries, parishes, and charitable organizations linked to the church that functioned as transit points for fleeing Nazis. One of the main ones was the Germanic-Hungarian College in Rome, operated by priests and accessed by figures linked to the SS. There, documents were forged, routes were arranged, and new identities were sealed with sacred seals. Among my grandfather's papers was a list of 10 names. Beside each one, an acronym, VB. At first, I thought it was irrelevant, until I crossed those initials with an organization called Vereinigung Bleiburg, an ultra-Catholic front that collaborated with the evacuation of Nazis to Latin America. My grandfather's name appeared at the bottom of the list, as a reception contact in Brazil. I didn't want to believe it. Everything inside me screamed for denial. But the facts piled up with the force of an avalanche. And then came the final confirmation, a copy of a baptismal certificate issued in 1948, bearing the seal of the Red Cross, authorizing the new Christian Helmut Wagner to travel under a false identity. In the margin of the paper, in barely legible handwriting, someone wrote, "Con la benedizione del Santo Padre." With the blessing of the Holy Father. My stomach churned. The new Christian was actually Franz Stengel, commandant of Sobibor and Treblinka, a man responsible for more than 800,000 deaths. Baptized, redeemed, embarked, and missing for 2 decades before being found, in Sao Paulo. There, in that moment, I understood that the church's role wasn't just one of omission. It was direct intervention. And most devastating of all, perhaps they truly believed they were doing good, saving souls, even if they were blood-stained souls. Or, worse, perhaps they didn't care. That part of my investigation destroyed me, because it violated not only history. It wounded my faith, my childhood memories, the moments I knelt in silence, waiting for answers. Now, the question that haunted me was another. How many of those figures I saw at the altar, in white cassocks and sweet words, knew everything? How many consecrated hands helped erase identities so that murderers crossed oceans without ever paying for their crimes? And once again, there was my grandfather, with his notes, his codes, his dry handwriting, like a shadow in all this behind the scenes. Silent, discreet, an accomplice. I don't know. But I know he carried this secret to the end. And perhaps, buried with it, are the names, the faces, and the screams of those who never received justice. The church taught that silence is a form of wisdom. But, faced with all this, silence becomes guilt. And now, I am the heir to that silence. But I will not keep it. There was something uncomfortably organized about it all. As if the world, immediately after the end of the war, had split into two, one of headlines, trials and promises of justice, and the other, the underground, of hidden smiles, open passages, and doors that closed forever behind the fugitives. And in this second world, Argentina was paradise. In my grandfather's documents, the country appeared more often than any other. Buenos Aires was mentioned in codes, pseudonyms, and dates. Route active until 1952, read one note. Contact, C. Blanco, guaranteed by Justo. I didn't know who these names were, but I soon discovered that Blanco was a common surname among Argentine diplomats. And Justo could be a reference to José Justo, linked to the Argentine Immigration Service at the time. It was impossible to ignore the accounts connecting all of this to the figure of Juan Domingo Perón. The man who ruled Argentina during that period was more than a populist politician. He was also an enthusiast of the so-called European New Order. And although he never publicly acknowledged this sympathy, his actions spoke for themselves. Between 1946 and 1952, more than 300 former members of the Nazi regime were welcomed in Argentina, and not as anonymous refugees, but as discreet guests, instructed to rebuild their lives far from Europe, far from justice. In a letter written in archaic Spanish, with an incomplete signature, I read, "The Republic will receive them as free men, if they know how to keep their history in silence. The Republic will receive them as free men, if they know how to keep their history in silence." In my grandfather's briefcase there was also a list of farms on the outskirts of Córdoba and Mendoza, places where newcomers were supposedly welcomed, trained to assume new identities, learn Spanish, and adopt new biographies. One of the points marked on the map was La Falda, a small town at the foot of the mountains. There stood the Hotel Eden, known as a stronghold of Nazi sympathizers since the 1930s. And again, the question pierced me like a blade. Had my grandfather been there? Among the papers was a faded photograph. A group of men in suits sat on wooden chairs in the middle of an open field. In the background, a colonial building. Beside the photo, a caption written in pencil, "Welcome Scene, Córdoba, 1949. I didn't immediately recognize any of the faces. But after days of comparing historical archives, I noticed a disturbing detail. One of the men in the image was none other than Erich Priebke. Yes, Priebke. The SS officer responsible for the Fosse Ardeatine massacre in Rome. A man convicted of war crimes. And there he was, smiling, toasting with Argentine wine, as if he were just another immigrant enjoying his new life. I began to understand the pattern. The Nazis weren't just fleeing to survive. They were starting over. And they did so with institutional, logistical, and political support. Argentina wasn't just a destination. It was a cradle for the silent reconstruction of an ideology defeated in Europe, but alive in the heart of South America. But what hurt most was realizing that all of this was recorded. In detail. In dates. In maps. In words. Inside the folder that had been kept for decades in my childhood home. And at the end of one of the letters, handwritten in German, a phrase made me freeze. Hier beginnt das neue Reich. Here begins the new Reich. Argentina wasn't just a hiding place. It was a plan. And maybe my grandfather wasn't just a passive witness. Maybe he was one of the cogs. Saying this out loud still pains me. Because it's admitting that the man who taught me to tie my shoelaces may have helped murderers escape. But papers don't lie. And the ghosts don't rest. In South America, they began again. And many, to this day, have never been found. There was something uncomfortably organized about it all. As if the world, just after the war's end, had split into two. The world of headlines, trials, and promises of justice, and the world of another, the underground, of hidden smiles, open passages, and doors that closed forever behind the fugitives. And in this second world, Argentina was paradise. In my grandfather's documents, the country appeared more often than any other. Buenos Aires was mentioned in codes, pseudonyms, and dates. Route active until 1952, red note. Contact, C. Blanco, guaranteed by Justo. I didn't know who these names were, but I soon discovered that Blanco was a common surname among Argentine diplomats. And Justo could be a reference to José Justo, linked to the Argentine Immigration Service at the time. It was impossible to ignore the reports connecting all of this to the figure of Juan Domingo Perón. The man who ruled Argentina during that period was more than a populist politician. He was also an enthusiast of the so-called European New Order. And although he never publicly acknowledged this sympathy, his actions speak for themselves. Between 1946 and 1952, more than 300 former members of the Nazi regime were welcomed in Argentina. And not as anonymous refugees, but as discreet guests, instructed to rebuild their lives far from Europe, far from justice. In a letter written in archaic Spanish, with an incomplete signature, I read, "The Republic will receive them as free men, if they know how to keep their history in silence. The Republic will receive them as free men, if they know how to keep their history in silence." In my grandfather's briefcase there was also a list of farms on the outskirts of Córdoba and Mendoza, places where newcomers were supposedly welcomed, trained to assume new identities, learn Spanish, and adopt new biographies. One of the points marked on the map was La Falda, a small town at the foot of the mountains. There stood the Hotel Eden, known as a stronghold of Nazi sympathizers since the 1930s. And again, the question pierced me like a blade. Had my grandfather been there? Among the papers was a faded photograph. A group of men in suits sat on wooden chairs in the middle of an open field. In the background, a colonial building. Beside the photo, a caption written in pencil, "Welcome Scene, Cordoba, 1949. I didn't immediately recognize any of the faces. But after days of comparing historical archives, I noticed a disturbing detail. One of the men in the image was none other than Erich Priebke. Yes, Priebke. The SS officer responsible for the Fosse Ardeatine massacre in Rome. A man convicted of war crimes. And there he was, smiling, toasting with Argentine wine, as if he were just another immigrant enjoying his new life. I began to understand the pattern. The Nazis weren't just fleeing to survive. They were starting over. And they did so with institutional, logistical, and political support. Argentina wasn't just a destination. It was a cradle for the silent reconstruction of an ideology defeated in Europe, but alive in the heart of South America. But what hurt most was realizing that all of this was recorded. In detail. In dates. In maps. In words. Inside the folder that had been kept for decades in my childhood home. And at the end of one of the letters, handwritten in German, a phrase made me freeze. Hier beginnt das neue Reich. Here begins the new Reich. Argentina wasn't just a hiding place. It was a plan. And maybe my grandfather wasn't just a passive witness. Maybe he was one of the cogs. Saying this out loud still pains me. Because it's admitting that the man who taught me to tie my shoelaces may have helped murderers escape. But papers don't lie. And the ghosts don't rest. In South America, they began again. And many, to this day, have never been found. By then, I had already delved deep into the rot hidden beneath the official story. But nothing prepared me for the moment I realized that the escape routes didn't end in Argentina. On the contrary, it was here, closer to home, where the trails became quieter and harder to trace. Brazil has always seemed distant from the European horrors of war. The national narrative portrays us as a country of welcome, peace, and miscegenation. But this image, I learned the hard way, was a curtain. A perfectly constructed facade to hide the monsters who discreetly landed at our ports, with clean passports, fake accents, and incinerated pasts. It was a small brown paper envelope, glued to the false bottom of my grandfather's briefcase, that revealed the next chapter in this labyrinth. Inside were old newspaper clippings, letters in Portuguese and Spanish, money-sending receipts, all linked to two specific regions, the interior of Parana and southern Paraguay. At that moment, the only name that came to mind was Joseph Mengele, the angel of death of Auschwitz, the doctor who chose who lived and who died with a nod. I knew he had died in Brazil, drowned on a beach in Bertioga, under a false identity. But what I didn't know, or didn't want to know, was that my grandfather might have known about his presence. Maybe he even helped him. Among the papers was a letter with no return address, but with a destination address, a farm on the outskirts of Nova Europa, in the interior of Sao Paulo. The handwriting was the same as other letters, my grandfather's. In the body of the message, one line froze me. Tell Helmut the doctor has arrived. His hip hurts, but he's holding on. He preferred the name Pedro. Helmut. Pedro. Hip pain. Everything fit. And there was more. A note in Spanish, written urgently. The Germans in Caguazu are under surveillance. The colonel has already been warned. We deactivated the station. Caguazu, Paraguay. Researching, I discovered that there had, in fact, been an isolated German community there, founded in the 1950s, with a strong presence of former military personnel. Some wore old uniforms at local festivals. The dominant language was German, and many had names that matched the list in my grandfather's briefcase. I visited the area weeks later, with a hidden camera and a light backpack. And what I saw still haunts me. The architecture of the houses, the features of their faces, the way they looked at me. Suspicious, cautious, as if they could see in my eyes that I didn't belong there. Or worse, as if they knew exactly what I was looking for. I spoke with an elderly gentleman, who offered me coffee. His German accent was strong. I asked about the history of the village and its founders. He smiled and replied, as if reciting an ancient prayer. They came from Europe, escaping the war. Good people. Hard-working. Silent. Silent. Always that word. Always that wall. In Brazil, I discovered that cities like Rolandia, Joinville, Blumenau, and parts of the interior of São Paulo had sheltered Nazis with clean papers, new lives, and invented stories. They opened businesses, had children, and died in peace. And all of this, somehow, passed through the hands of people like my grandfather, who knew the real names, the real faces, and yet chose silence. I found myself looking at my own birth certificate, the surname, the origins, the family history that had always been told to me in bits and pieces. And I wondered, how many of our neighbors, teachers, doctors, bakers, carried blood from the wrong side of the war? Brazil and Paraguay were more than destinations. They were tombs for the truth. And now that I had begun to unearth it, I could no longer stop. His name was a kind of cold whisper that spanned generations. Joseph Mengele, the doctor of Auschwitz, the executioner in the white coat. For years, I had heard him spoken of as a distant monster, a mythological creature whose atrocities seemed too unreal to have ever existed. But as I delved into my grandfather's archives, all of this ceased to be legend. Mengele was not a European ghost. He lived here, among us. Perhaps it even passed through the streets I know. In the papers, I found something that left me paralyzed, a copy of a receipt dated 1962, with an illegible signature, but stamped with an address in Serra Negra, in the interior of São Paulo. It was a small, remote rural clinic. The document listed specialized medical services. And among the handwritten notes, a highlighted sentence. Dr. Pedro will personally handle the evaluation. Pedro, the same name mentioned earlier in my grandfather's encrypted letters. As the pieces fell into place, I realized that this Dr. Pedro was Mengele, living under a false identity, working as a doctor, treating patients, starting over, terrifyingly, with impunity. I spoke with a local historian who greeted me reluctantly. When I mentioned the name Mengele, he shifted in his chair. He crossed his arms. He sighed. After a thick silence, he spoke almost in a whisper. There are people here who swore he was just an old German. Kind. Polite. He treated those who couldn't pay for free. That sentence shuddered me to my core. The man who experimented on children in Auschwitz, froze twins alive, injected dye into victims' eyes to Germanize them, who decided who died and who went to the ovens with a nod, this man treated for free in the Brazilian countryside. In my grandfather's briefcase, I found a faded photo. A thin man in a light-colored suit and round glasses. Beside him, my grandfather. The two of them appeared to be in a garden. There was no date, but judging by the aging of the image, it must have been from the 1970s. Behind them, a sign, Estancia P. Probably Pauso Alegre or Piracicaba, perhaps Paranapanema. I couldn't identify it for sure. But it confirmed everything I feared. My grandfather knew Mengele. He was with him. He protected him. I started having nightmares. I dreamed of twins looking at me in the dark, empty eyes, asking me, "Did you know?" And I always answered, "No." But deep down, I already knew. I just didn't want to accept it. Mengele died in 1979, drowned on Bertioga Beach, anonymous. Buried as Wolfgang Gerhard, a made-up name. 20 years of escape, 20 years of lies. And only in 1985, after exhumation, DNA testing, and international pressure, did the world receive confirmation that the angel of death had died on Brazilian soil, without ever having been tried, without ever having asked for forgiveness. When I read the official forensic report, I felt a lump in my throat. It wasn't justice. It was just a bureaucratic final point. A false closure to a story that never found balance. Because the truth, even revealed, doesn't cleanse the blood. And perhaps worst of all is knowing that Mengele didn't escape alone. He had help. He was given shelter. He was protected by networks, by governments, by ordinary people, by families, and perhaps, it still pains me to say, by someone of my own blood. The angel of death lived among us. He ate in the same restaurants, breathed the same air, walked the same sidewalks. And no one did anything, because everyone wanted to forget. But I didn't forget. And now, you won't forget either. When you grow up believing that good and evil are clearly defined, that priests represent the sacred, and criminals represent hell, it's hard to accept that sometimes hell wears a cassock. It was an envelope bearing the Vatican coat of arms, carefully tucked inside a Bible with hollow pages, that made me see what I hadn't wanted to. The Bible belonged to my grandfather. He kept it on his bookshelf as a symbol of faith. But now I understood, it wasn't faith. It was a secret. It was a passage. Inside the envelope were letters, sealed with the seal of an organization I would only discover days later, the Pontifical Assistance Commission. An innocent, almost charitable name. But behind it lurked a shadowy structure. It was through this commission that the Vatican brokered false documents, passports, and logistical support for fleeing Nazis. These routes became known as ratlines, rat lines, and the lines always led to the same destinations: Spain, Italy, Argentina, Brazil. One of the documents mentioned a name I'd seen before in my grandfather's encrypted letters: Father Krunoslav Draganovic. He was a Croatian priest based in Rome who organized these routes with surgical precision. According to the archives, he had direct connections with monasteries and convents that served as temporary hiding places for fugitives, until their new papers were ready. Reading this was like tearing the fabric of reality. The church, which I saw as the spiritual guide of my childhood, had washed away the sins of Nazism with baptismal ink. And there was more. A Red Cross passport, a legitimate one, issued in Geneva, in the name of a certain Ricardo Clement. The assumed name of Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the final solution. It was with this document that he entered Argentina. And once again, amidst the papers, I found my grandfather's handwriting. Delivery made via Buenos Aires. Intermediary, Friar M. Protection is guaranteed until Cordoba. Friar M. The name seemed too small for the weight it carried. In Cordoba, Argentina, there was a Catholic school where several Nazis spent their early years of imprisonment. Among them was Klaus Barbie, known as the Butcher of Lyon. All protected by a network that included priests, monks, Vatican diplomats, and, apparently, men like my grandfather. After all, why would he have such specific documents? Why would he hide them so carefully if he wasn't involved in something? I visited an old parish in southern Brazil, mentioned in one of the notes. The place was beautiful, peaceful, covered in vines. But something about it didn't feel right. I spoke with an elderly priest, and when I mentioned Dragonovic's name, his eyes twitched. Some were saved, because everyone deserves salvation, he said with a wry smile. Even after what they did. I asked. He made the sign of the cross. Then he murmured, almost lamenting, "The church does not judge. It only welcomes." But I judged. At that moment, in the cold silence of the sacristy, I understood. Those monsters didn't come in hiding, they didn't flee alone. They were welcomed. Welcomed. In the name of faith. In the name of a false reconciliation. The Vatican knew. Not officially, of course. But they knew. And more than that, they facilitated it. The feeling that accompanied me back on the road was one of nausea. The faith I had in institutions crumbled like hollow walls. And only one certainty remained, beating inside my chest like a drum. The truth is always behind the curtain. And whoever lifts it, rarely sleeps peacefully again. For a long time, I imagined that monsters lived in the shadows. That they hid like rats, fleeing the light. But as I dug deeper, I realized something even more disturbing. The monsters didn't hide, they reinvented themselves. They became neighbors, teachers, merchants. and no one noticed. It was in a village in the Misiones region of northern Argentina that this truth hit me like a punch in the gut. I was following the tracks of a man named Hans Ulrich, a German name, seemingly harmless. But according to documents in the Interpol archives, Ulrich was the pseudonym of Franz Stengel, commandant of the Treblinka extermination camp. In town, I asked about Ulrich, and to my surprise, the older people remembered him well. An educated man. He repaired watches, said a white-haired woman with a slight German accent. He worked at the church. Very religious. He never hurt anyone, commented another, unaware he was describing a genocidal perpetrator. It was then that I understood the full extent of the farce. These men didn't live hidden in dark basements. They lived among flowers, under the hot South American sun. They cultivated gardens. They were called Mr. Doctor, Professor Klaus, Uncle Otto. They started over. They raised families. They ate barbecues on Sundays and danced tangos at village festivals. I found old photos. A birthday party from the 1960s. Colorful balloons. Children laughing. And in the background of the image, almost erased, a man with the face I had memorized from so many readings, Erich Priep, former SS officer, responsible for the Fosse Ardeatine massacre, where more than 300 civilians were executed in retaliation. In the photo, he smiled, as if he had never pulled a trigger. But it was in Brazil that the shock became personal. In Santa Catarina, I visited a small village with a strong German presence. Many of the residents had surnames I recognized from the archives: Lenz, Richter, Meller. Of course, that didn't mean anything in itself. But what bothered me was the silence, the kind of silence that weighs heavily. It seems rehearsed. I went to an old barbershop, recommended by a local. There, the barber, a man in his late 90s, with a keen memory, mentioned having cut the hair of a mysterious German for decades. He never said his name. He was called simply Herr Director. I showed an old worn photo of Walter Roth, the inventor of mobile gas trucks, where prisoners were asphyxiated with carbon monoxide. The old barber looked. His eyes narrowed. Then he simply nodded, lowering his gaze. I didn't need words. There he was, the elegant executioner, cleaning his boots on the sidewalk, smearing shaving cream on his face, paying in cruzeros, smiling at his neighbors. For decades, many of these men lived a second life, protected by neighborhoods that preferred to ignore the past, by governments that turned a blind eye in exchange for military or technical expertise, and by complicit networks, like the one my own grandfather perhaps helped maintain. And while the ashes of Auschwitz still lingered in the European air, here they were reborn, with new names, new stories, new families. That was what hurt most. They had the right to start over. Their victims didn't. And perhaps this is humanity's greatest sin, not what we do, but what we allow to be forgotten. When I began this search, I imagined I would find only documents, names, faces. But the truth was far more painful. I discovered that silence was the fugitive's greatest ally. That fleeing to South America wasn't enough. They needed a place where no one would ask questions, where their eyes closed to the shadows passing through the streets. And, to my surprise, I found this in small communities, in neighborhoods, in whispered conversations. I visited cities, villages, neighborhoods where families had stories intertwined with the surnames that appeared in the archives. I asked, listened, took notes. But whenever the word Nazi came up, it was as if an invisible wall were erected before me. Silence became a shield, a tacit pact. I met Dona Maria, a woman who lives in a quiet neighborhood in the interior of Parana. She told me that her family welcomed German immigrants fleeing Europe shortly after the war. She spoke of the festivals, the traditions, the language that still echoes in the local churches. But when I brought up the subject of the war, her eyes filled with tears and she whispered, "They never talked about it." It was as if they were leaving everything behind, but the past weighed heavily. No one wanted to bring bad memories back here. This, not wanting to know, was constant. In another city, I heard from a resident. We preferred to believe they were just ordinary men. We didn't want to know about the horrors. But omission has a price. People died, families were destroyed, entire communities mourned the losses in Europe. And here, in the New World, silence became a wall that protected the criminals and muffled the cries of the victims. I thought of the children who grew up alongside these men, of the students who sat in the same classroom as former officers, of the clients who shook hands with a doctor without knowing he had been an executioner. I wondered how many times my grandfather had been at dinners, conversations, gatherings where the past was omitted, veiled, covered up. And what's worse, I realized that he, like many others, knew that this pact existed. I knew that, to protect the Nazis, I also needed to protect the silence of the communities. Not only the silence of the powerful, but the silence of everyday life, of neighbors, of friends. And this silence is a burden I carry with me now. Because revealing the truth means breaking the pact. And breaking the pact means awakening old ghosts, not just from a distant past, but from those who live among us. But I can no longer remain silent. The truth demands to be told. Even if it hurts. Even if it points to our own homes. Because only when the silence ends can we begin to heal the wounds. And only when we face the past without fear can we build a future where justice is not a privilege, but an obligation. After months immersed in this abyss of secrets and shadows, I found myself facing a question that haunts me. What to do with all this? With these names, faces, hidden stories, with the weight of the silence I have carried from generation to generation? How can we transform this burden into something that doesn't destroy, but builds? It's strange to admit, but the truth hurts. It's a cold blade that cuts not only the past, but the present. Because revealing these stories isn't just about Nazis fleeing to South America. The silence that protected murderers for decades wasn't just cowardice. It was complicity. And worse, it was a silent pact not to look the other way. Not to know. To let the ghosts live in peace, while the world cried out for justice. But I can't remain silent any longer. Not after everything I've discovered. My grandfather, who carried so many secrets, was a link in this network. Perhaps he believed he was doing the right thing. Perhaps he was simply following orders. Or perhaps he was even a knowing accomplice. I can't judge him completely, but I can expose what he hid. Because the only way to honor the victims is to never forget. Never let time erase the memory of the horror. And never allow history to repeat itself. Today, I tell this story to you, who are listening. To you who want to understand that evil is not a legend, that monsters once walked among us, and that many still live in silence, with new masks. The story I told is not a movie script. It's real, raw, uncomfortable, and, above all, it's a call. A call for each of us to look around, to question, to seek the truth, even when it hurts. Because only then, together, can we break the cycle of silence and impunity. If this story touched you, instigated you, disturbed you, made you think, I ask you, don't let this story die here. Share it, question it, research it, learn it, and, if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. Here, we will continue unearthing truths, confronting taboos, and illuminating the dark corners the world prefers to forget. Because justice begins in memory. And memory only lives as long as someone keeps it alive. Never forget. I have always fought.